Picture this. It's the late 19th century, and America's wealthiest families are throwing parties so extravagant they're talked about for generations. Mansions gleam along Fifth Avenue in New York. Diamonds drip from the necks of women whose last names are Vanderbilt, Astor, and Rockefeller. Society columns breathlessly report every ball, every gown, every gesture. But behind the golden curtains, behind the public smiles and the perfectly arranged place settings, something far darker was taking root. A secret economy of fear. A hidden marketplace where reputations were bought and sold, and the most powerful people in the country lived in terror of one misstep, one whispered truth. Because in the shadows of all that glittering excess, a sophisticated blackmail ring was quietly thriving, preying on the very elite who believed themselves untouchable. This wasn't just about scandalous love letters or petty gossip. This was a calculated operation targeting foundational secrets, the kind that could unravel a fortune or erase a family name from high society's sacred roster. Think of the immense pressure these titans of industry and heirs to old money faced. They built empires in steel, railroads, and banking, clawing their way into circles that once excluded them. Their position was everything, and that made them vulnerable. What would a railroad magnate pay to keep his wife from learning of his second family? What would a so-called new money heiress sacrifice to prevent society from discovering her humble origins? The blackmailers knew. They hunted not for small change, but for fortunes, for power, for the soul of the Gilded Age itself. What you're about to discover is a story of audacity and deception playing out in gilded drawing rooms and private clubs. It's a tale where the line between predator and prey was often blurred, where the keepers of secrets became prisoners of their own lies. We're going to pull back the velvet rope and step into this hidden world, meeting the cunning figures who masterminded the extortion and the terrified elites who fueled it. You'll see how the relentless pursuit of status created a perfect hunting ground for corruption. So settle in. What unfolds is more than history. It's a window into the timeless dance between power, perception, and the price of keeping up appearances. To understand how this blackmail ring could flourish, you have to truly appreciate the world it preyed upon. This wasn't just a time of wealth. It was a theater of social warfare, and the stage was breathtakingly opulent. In Manhattan, Fifth Avenue was a canyon of limestone and marble shadows, each one a monument to a family's fortune. But the real battles were fought not in boardrooms, but in ballrooms. The ultimate prize was an invitation to Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr.'s annual ball. She was the undisputed queen of New York society, and her guest list, famously limited to the 400 people who could fit in her ballroom, was the only one that truly mattered. To be excluded from Mrs. Astor's list was to be a nobody. This obsession with status created an environment of immense pressure and paranoia. For the old money families like the Astors, it was a relentless defense of their exclusive club. For the new money titans, the Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, and Morgans, it was an expensive, grueling campaign for acceptance. They built palaces not just to live in, but as weapons. Alva Vanderbilt's legendary costume ball in 1883, which cost $250,000, an almost unimaginable sum at the time, wasn't just a party. It was a brilliantly executed siege on Mrs. Astor's castle. By very publicly snubbing Alva's invitation, Mrs. Astor had overplayed her hand. The new money was simply too powerful to ignore, and Alva's spectacular event forced the Queen to finally acknowledge her. It was a seismic shift in the social order, proving that with enough money and audacity, the gates could be forced open. And then there was Newport, Rhode Island. If New York was the battlefield, Newport was the playground where the victors went to flaunt their spoils. They called their colossal, sprawling mansions cottages, a term of absurd understatement. The breakers' marble house, the elms, these were not homes. They were statements in stone, designed to dwarf European castles. Here, the social calendar was a relentless whirl of luncheons, teas, and balls, each event more lavish than the last. It was in these gilded rooms, amidst the rustle of silk and the clink of champagne glasses, that reputations were meticulously crafted and just as easily destroyed. A single misstep, a whispered rumor overheard by a servant, a careless comment reported in the society pages, any of it could mean instant exile. This is the crucible that forged the perfect conditions for blackmail. When your entire identity, your family's legacy, and your hard-won social standing are dependent on maintaining a flawless public image, you become dangerously vulnerable. The fear of exposure wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about annihilation. The blackmailers of the era understood this psychology perfectly. They knew that a man who had spent millions to build a mansion and buy his way into society would pay a fortune to keep a single, damaging secret from seeing the light of day. In a world where appearance was everything, the truth was the most valuable and most dangerous commodity of all. In this world of impossible opulence, money was everywhere, but it was almost worthless on its own. The true currency, the one that determined your place in the social heavens, was reputation. A sterling reputation could open doors that millions of dollars could not. A tarnished one could exile a family for generations, no matter the size of their bank account. This wasn't a casual preference. It was a rigid, unforgiving code governed by an unwritten set of rules as complex as any legal system. The elite lived under a microscope. In every action, from the cut of a gown to the guest list for a dinner party, was scrutinized for its adherence to this invisible law. At the heart of this system was the obsession with lineage. For the old guard, the Knickerbocker families who could trace their roots back to the original Dutch settlers, a pure and respectable bloodline was the only thing that truly mattered. It was their shield against the tidal wave of new industrial wealth. They looked down upon the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers as vulgar, shoddy aristocracy, their fortunes too new, too loud, and too obviously earned through labor. To these established clans, working for a living was a social sin. True gentility meant your money worked for you, inherited over so many generations that its original source was a genteel, forgotten mystery. This created a frantic desire among the newly rich to fabricate a past worthy of their present. Genealogists were employed to discover or invent a noble ancestor overseas. Family crests were designed and emblazoned on everything from carriages to silverware. Some even went so far as to purchase ancient European titles through marriage, a practice that became a lucrative industry for cash-poor nobility willing to trade a title for an infusion of American dollars. The ultimate validation, the final seal of approval for a new money dynasty, was to marry into the European aristocracy. This was the fast track to legitimacy, a way to launder a fortune through a royal bloodline. But this market for titles was a treacherous minefield. The ancient families of Europe were just as obsessed with lineage as their American counterparts, and they employed investigators to meticulously vet potential brides. A single rumor, a whisper of scandal about a young heiress's parentage, her family's business practices, or even a relative who had been involved in a public dispute, could shatter the entire arrangement. The blackmailers knew this was the most sensitive pressure point. A letter hinting at a hidden scandal could derail a merger between an American fortune and a European title, costing a family not just their social aspirations, but the millions spent on the courtship and dowry. The threat wasn't just to their good name, it was a direct financial catastrophe. Beyond these grand ambitions, reputation governed the minute details of daily life. Exclusion from the right clubs, like the Patriarch's balls or the gentlemen's clubs of Fifth Avenue, was a social death sentence. Being left off a guest list for a major ball was a public humiliation reported gleefully in the newspapers. In this hothouse environment, gossip wasn't a pastime, it was a weapon. A story about a husband's infidelity or a wife's excessive gambling debts didn't just make for juicy tea time conversation. It could freeze a family out of the financial deals that were made on the golf course or in the private smoking room. Business and society were inextricably linked. A loss of social standing meant a loss of business alliances, of credit, of influence. This is why the elite were so terrifyingly vulnerable. Their wealth was built on a foundation of perception, and the blackmailers held the wrecking ball. They traded not in secrets, but in the very soul of the Gilded Age itself, the fragile, priceless illusion of perfection. So who were the shadowy figures capable of operating such a scheme right under the noses of the most powerful people in America? They weren't criminal masterminds in the traditional sense. Instead, they were opportunists who possessed one invaluable asset: intimate access. The architects of this sophisticated blackmail ring emerged from the very fabric of elite society itself. Individuals who moved through the glittering world of the upper class, but lived on its fringes, perfectly positioned to see both the public performances and the private truths. At the top of this list were disgruntled former servants, a lady's maid who was fired without a reference, a valet who overheard one too many damaging confidences, a butler dismissed after decades of loyal service. These individuals knew where all the bodies were buried, quite literally in some cases. They had spent years in the inner sanctum, privy to the family's most intimate moments. They knew which husband slipped out of the house at odd hours, which wife had a secret drinking problem concealed with scented handkerchiefs, which daughter had been secretly sent to Europe to discreetly have a child. When cast out without a pension or a prospect, that knowledge curdled from loyalty into a weapon. Their revenge was not a violent outburst, but a carefully calculated letter, offering silence in exchange for a steady income. Then there were the unscrupulous private investigators. In an era before formalized law enforcement, wealthy families often hired these operatives for delicate matters: to investigate a potential son-in-law's background, to discreetly follow a wayward spouse, or to recover stolen jewelry without a public scandal. These detectives learned the darkest secrets of the elite as part of their job. The most morally flexible among them realized they could get paid twice. First, by the client who hired them, and then again by the subject they investigated, who would pay handsomely to keep their report from ever seeing the light of day. They were merchants of information, and they understood its value on the open market. But perhaps the most brazen and powerful figure in this hidden economy was the gossip columnist. No one embodied this role more than Colonel William Dalton Mann, the publisher of the society journal Town Topics. On the surface, his publication was a weekly chronicle of the comings and goings of the elite, listing who was vacationing where and what they wore to the opera. But it was famously nicknamed the Bible of the 400, and Colonel Mann was its feared and vengeful god. He operated a protection racket disguised as journalism. His writers, often young men from good families who needed cash, would be planted at parties to gather the most salacious rumors. Mann would then contact the subject of the story and offer them a choice: purchase a subscription to Town Topics for a wildly inflated price, often thousands of dollars, or see the damaging item printed for all of society to read. He didn't deal in vague threats. His ledgers meticulously recorded these loans and subscriptions from the richest families in America, effectively making him a millionaire by selling silence. He was so powerful that even the formidable Mrs. Astor was rumored to be one of his regular subscribers, paying to keep her family's name clear of his poisonous pen. Completing this cast of characters were the fallen aristocrats themselves. These were men and women from good families who had squandered their fortunes or whose names no longer commanded the respect they once did. They still had entry to the ballrooms and clubs, their bloodline granting them a passport that others worked for decades to obtain. But they used this access not for social enjoyment, but for intelligence gathering. They were the ultimate insiders, able to overhear a confidential business discussion at a gentleman's club, or notice the subtle tension between a husband and wife at a dinner party. Their intimate understanding of social codes allowed them to spot the slightest breach, the most minute crack in the flawless facade. They would then broker this information to Colonel Mann or directly to the individuals involved, trading on their birthright one final time to fund their decline. Together, this unlikely consortium of the slighted, the unethical, and the desperate formed a predatory network that turned the Gilded Age's greatest weakness, its obsession with reputation, into a thriving, shadowy industry. The mechanics of this extortion were as carefully crafted as the social performances they sought to undermine. It often began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, chilling discovery. A gentleman would settle into his leather-upholstered carriage for his morning commute downtown, only to find a sealed envelope resting on the seat opposite him. A society matron, having her morning coffee, would unfold her copy of the New York Times and watch as a plain, unmarked note fluttered into her lap. There was no return address, no identifying mark. The anonymity itself was the first layer of the threat, a ghostly reminder that the sender could be anyone: a servant, a club acquaintance, a stranger in the street. They were always watching. The language within these notes was a masterpiece of sinister implication, a study in saying everything by saying nothing at all. They never bluntly stated the secret. Instead, they danced around it with elegant, poisonous prose. A note might begin by expressing sincere concern for the recipient's esteemed reputation, then mention a certain matter recently brought to our attention that, if it were to become common knowledge, would surely cause irreparable distress to your good lady wife, or grave complications for your forthcoming business merger with the Morgan interests. The writer would profess a deep, almost paternal desire to avoid such an unpleasantness, positioning themselves not as a criminal, but as a discreet business partner offering a vital service, the preservation of silence. The demand for payment was always couched in the language of high finance and mutual benefit, never as crude blackmail. It was never pay me or I'll talk. Instead, the target was invited to make a prudent investment in a joint venture of discretion, or to pay a consultation fee for the writer's ongoing advisory services on the matter. The sums requested were astronomical, designed to be painful but not quite bankrupting. A few $1,000s, perhaps 10 or 20, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today. This was not a one-time shakedown. It was the opening of a subscription. The blackmailers understood that a secret never truly goes away. It requires perpetual management, and that meant a reliable, ongoing revenue stream. The initial payment was merely a down payment on a lifetime of silence. The instructions for payment were a further exercise in psychological manipulation, designed to maximize anxiety and minimize any chance of tracing the culprit. The victim might be told to place unmarked bills in a specific book on a specific shelf at the store library at a precise time, or to leave a sealed packet under a particular bench in Madison Square Park after dusk. These dead drop locations turned the city itself into a nerve-wracking maze for the terrified elite. Every public space became a potential site for a humiliating transaction, every stranger a potential accomplice. This method ensured the blackmailer never had to show their face, never had to risk a face-to-face meeting that could lead to identification or capture. The power dynamic was absolute. The victim, despite all their wealth and influence, was completely alone, jumping at shadows and following the orders of a ghost, all to protect the glittering illusion they had worked so desperately to build. Consider the predicament of a man like Cornelius Holloway, a name we've invented for our story, but whose circumstances were all too real. Holloway was a titan of American railroads, a man who commanded fleets of steam engines and the fates of thousands of employees. His public image was one of granite-like integrity, a devoted husband to his socially prominent wife, Eleanor, and a stern but loving father to their 3 children, whose portraits hung in the gilded drawing room of their Fifth Avenue mansion. His reputation was the bedrock of his business, the guarantee to investors that a Holloway enterprise was as solid and reliable as the tracks his trains ran on. The first hint of trouble arrived not with a bang, but with the subtle, sickening drop of a single envelope onto his highly polished desk. It had been placed there, he later realized, by a temporary secretary hired that week, a planted operative. The letter inside was short, typed on expensive bond paper, and utterly devastating. It did not accuse. It merely stated that the writer was aware of the well-being of a certain young woman, a former seamstress named Mary, and her 5-year-old son, Thomas, who currently resided in a modest boarding house in Brooklyn. The letter noted, with a tone of almost clinical detachment, the boy's striking resemblance to a certain public figure, particularly in the shape of his eyes and the set of his jaw. It concluded by suggesting that such a resemblance, if widely known, could cause immeasurable pain to your admirable family and unfortunate speculation among your business associates. Holloway's world did not so much shatter as it instantly inverted. The love affair had been a brief, reckless moment years prior, a casualty of the immense pressure he was under and a loneliness his marriage could not soothe. He had provided for Mary, setting up a small, quiet annuity to ensure she wanted for nothing, believing the matter settled and forever secret. Now, that single vulnerability, that one human lapse, had become a weapon aimed directly at the heart of everything he had built. The blackmailer was not asking for a one-time payment. They demanded an annual patronage of $10,000, a king's ransom, to be delivered in unmarked bills, with the implicit understanding that the demands would continue for as long as the secret had value, which was to say, for the rest of his life. The logistics of the payoff became a secret second career for Holloway. He could not simply withdraw such sums without raising eyebrows at the bank, or, worse, with his wife, who managed the household accounts with a shrewd eye. He began orchestrating complex financial maneuvers, creating false invoices from phantom suppliers to his railroad company, siphoning the money slowly and carefully from his business accounts into a private fund he alone controlled. The emotional toll was even greater. Every time his youngest daughter ran to him with open arms, he saw the ghost of another boy, denied his name. Every public appearance with Elinor became an act of profound guilt, his smile a rigid mask over a churning sea of fear. He became paranoid, seeing potential conspirators in every new servant, every unfamiliar face at his club, every journalist who glanced his way for a moment too long. The most elaborate deception was reserved for the payments themselves, following instructions delivered in fragments through subsequent letters. Holloway became a ghost in his own city. On a foggy Tuesday evening, he might be instructed to walk a specific circuit around Central Park, finally depositing a packet of bills into a hollow at the base of a designated oak tree. Months later, he might be told to purchase a first-class ticket on a train to Philadelphia, leave the sealed envelope on his seat, and disembark before the train departed, watching his secret and his money pull away from the station without him. Each transaction was a fresh humiliation for a man accustomed to command, a stark reminder that for all his power and prestige, he was now taking orders from a phantom. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, paying a fortune not for silence, but for the continued permission to live the lie that defined his entire existence. But for every titan of industry guarding a secret family, there was a young heiress navigating an equally perilous landscape of expectation. If a man's vulnerability was often his past actions, a woman's was almost always her future prospects. In the marriage market of the Gilded Age, a woman's value was her perceived purity, her impeccable behavior, and her spotless reputation. A single whisper of impropriety could render her damaged goods, unmarriageable to a suitable man of her own class, to say nothing of the coveted European nobility. This made young women like Arabella Huntington, our second case study, the perfect targets for a particularly cruel form of extortion. Arabella was not just any heiress. She was the stepdaughter of Collies P. Huntington, one of the legendary Big Four railroad tycoons who built the Central Pacific Railroad. Her life was a whirlwind of opulence, dividing time between a San Francisco mansion, a New York palace, and the sprawling grounds of her stepfather's estate. She was beautiful, educated, and immensely wealthy, the very portrait of a prized bride. Her family's ambitions for her were sky high, aiming for a union with a duke or at the very least a scion of one of America's oldest, most unimpeachable families. Every aspect of her life was meticulously curated and chaperoned to present an image of flawless, untouchable virtue. The attack, when it came, was both brutal and insidiously clever. It began with a series of anonymous letters sent not to Arabella, but directly to her formidable stepfather, Collies Huntington. The envelopes contained carefully copied excerpts of what appeared to be intensely passionate love letters, all signed with Arabella's name. The recipient named in these letters was not a suitable gentleman from their social circle, but a charismatic and handsome Italian riding instructor who had been employed at the estate the previous summer. The prose was flowery, desperate, and shockingly intimate, detailing secret trysts and profound emotional declarations that, if genuine, would shatter every carefully constructed notion of Arabella's character. The demand was straightforward. A payment of $50,000 would ensure the original letters, the alleged proof of this illicit affair, would be returned and the matter forgotten. Failure to pay would result in the complete correspondence being sent to every major society hostess in New York and Newport, effectively ending Arabella's social life before it had truly begun. The threat was perfectly calibrated. For Collies Huntington, a man who had built an empire by crushing his opponents, this was not a business negotiation. It was an assault on his most valuable asset, the marriageable purity of his daughter, which was key to securing a powerful dynasty. A frantic family council was convened behind closed doors. The first and most agonizing question was the one that would haunt them all. Were the letters real? Arabella, hysterical and humiliated, swore they were monstrous forgeries. She admitted the riding instructor had been charming and that she had enjoyed their lessons, but she vehemently denied any impropriety, let alone composing such scandalous prose. The family wanted to believe her, but a sliver of doubt was the blackmailer's most effective tool. Handwriting experts were discreetly consulted, some claiming the writing was a skilled imitation, others seeing troubling similarities. In the pre-forensic science era, the analysis was subjective at best. The very act of investigating it cast a shadow of suspicion over Arabella, making her the subject of quiet, horrified scrutiny within her own home. The decision they faced was impossible. Paying the ransom was an admission of guilt, a silent confirmation that the letters were real and that Arabella was compromised. It would also establish a precedent, making them permanent victims to future demands. But refusing to pay was an unimaginable risk. The destruction would be absolute. No noble family, no matter how in need of funds, would ever align their bloodline with such a public scandal. Arabella would be a pariah, a living cautionary tale whispered about behind fans at every ball. Her life would be effectively over. After days of torturous deliberation, Huntington, the ruthless negotiator, did the one thing he thought guaranteed his daughter's future. He paid. The money was delivered in a tense, secretive exchange, and a packet of letters was returned. But the damage was far from undone. The scandal, though contained, had a chilling effect. The story had already begun to leak in vague, poisonous whispers. The most desirable suitors, those with titles and ancient names, suddenly became elusive. Arabella's engagement to a minor English lord the following year was seen by many not as a triumph, but as a strategic retreat. A marriage secured with a massive dowry to a family willing to overlook the persistent rumors. The blackmail had achieved its goal. It hadn't just extracted a fortune, it had irrevocably altered the course of a life, proving that in this gilded world, the mere suggestion of sin could be as damning as the sin itself. Within the grand mansions of the Gilded Age, a second, invisible household operated in perfect synchrony with the family's public life. This parallel world was run by the domestic staff, a small army of butlers, housekeepers, ladies' maids, and valets who saw everything and said nothing. Or at least that was the expectation. In the economy of high society secrets, these individuals were the most valuable currency, acting as both the primary intelligence network for blackmailers and, if their loyalty held, the most crucial shield against them. The hierarchy of service was a strict mirror of the society it served. At the pinnacle stood the butler, the undisputed commander of the household's domestic operations. He controlled access to the master of the house, screened his correspondence, and was often the custodian of the wine cellar in the household accounts. His knowledge was comprehensive and potentially devastating. A valet was arguably even more intimate in his role. He dressed the gentleman, helped him bathe, and was entrusted with the care of his most personal possessions. He knew which letters were hidden in a locked drawer, which cufflinks were a gift from a mistress, and the exact state of his employer's finances from the quality of the tips he received. On the female side, the lady's maid held a position of immense trust and proximity. She was hairstylist, wardrobe mistress, and confidante, helping her mistress dress and undress every day. She knew about discreet pregnancies, hidden birthmarks, the source of mysterious bruises, and the secret purchases made away from the husband's knowledge. She was the first to see the tear-stained pillow after a marital argument, and the first to know about a clandestine romance. Below them, a legion of footmen, cooks, and housemaids completed the web, each pair of eyes and ears potentially gathering a fragment of a larger, damaging puzzle. Loyalty in this environment was a complex and frequently purchased commodity. For some staff, particularly those from generations of service in the same family, the bond was feudal and unbreakable. Their identity was intertwined with the prestige of the household they served. For the vast majority, however, loyalty was a transaction, balanced against low wages, long hours, and the constant, glaring juxtaposition of their own poverty against the staggering opulence they maintained every day. A blackmailer or an unscrupulous gossip columnist like Colonel Mann understood this dynamic perfectly. A discreetly offered bribe could represent more money than a maid might earn in a year. For a servant saving to bring their family over from Ireland, or simply tired of living in a cramped attic room, the temptation to trade a single piece of information for financial security could be overwhelming. This created a chilling atmosphere of paranoia within the home itself. The wealthy family lived in a golden fishbowl, surrounded by people they relied upon but could never fully trust. Every conversation in a hallway had to be measured, every private letter locked away. The very people who ensured their comfort also held the power to dismantle their lives. A dismissed servant, particularly one fired without a reference or a pension, was not just a staffing problem. They were a walking security breach, a rogue agent carrying a dossier of intimate secrets directly into the hands of those who would pay for it. Yet, for all the potential for betrayal, a trusted servant was the best protection a family could buy. A sharp-eyed butler could identify and dismiss a footman he suspected of being planted by a blackmailer to gather intelligence. A loyal lady's maid was the first line of defense, intercepting an anonymous note before it reached her mistress's hands, or spotting a suspicious loiterer outside the townhouse. These servants understood the social codes and the stakes better than anyone. Their silence was a fortress, but it was a fortress that required careful maintenance through fair treatment, generous bonuses, and above all, respect. In the shadow war of Gilded Age blackmail, the battle was often won or lost not in the ballroom, but in the servants' hall, where loyalty was the ultimate and most fragile luxury. Of all the predators operating in the shadow economy, none were as brazen, as systematic, or as insulated from consequences as the society press. While individual blackmailers worked in the dark, these publications operated in plain sight, hiding their extortion behind the respectable facade of journalism. They turned gossip into a corporate enterprise, and at the center of this corrupt universe was one man and his notorious publication, Colonel William Dalton Mann and his weekly journal, Town Topics. For decades, this so-called journal of society functioned less as a newspaper and more as a protection racket, perfecting a scheme that came to be known in whispered circles as libel licensing. On its surface, Town Topics was a chronicle of the elite. Its pages were filled with breathless accounts of the latest balls, detailed descriptions of extravagant gowns, and updates on which wealthy families were summering in Newport or sailing to Europe. To an outsider, it was simply a peek behind the velvet rope. But for those who lived within its gaze, every issue was a potential minefield. The magazine's real power lay in a back section, often just a few paragraphs long, filled with witty, vicious, and unsigned items that dripped with salacious implication. A sentence might coyly question the sudden, extended tour of Europe, taken by a young debutante, or muse about the source of a certain industrialist's remarkable luck at the racetrack. It was never a direct accusation, but the insinuation was always clear. And in a world run on reputation, the hint of scandal was as damaging as a full confession. Colonel Mann, a Civil War veteran with a flamboyant mustache and an unshakable sense of entitlement, orchestrated this operation with military precision. His method was simple, ruthless, and brilliant. A reporter, often a young, well-connected man fallen on hard times, would be tasked with gathering a particularly damaging piece of gossip. Once the item was written and typeset, Mann would not immediately publish it. Instead, he would send a discreet messenger to the subject of the story, informing them that a potentially embarrassing item was slated for the next issue. The messenger would then offer a solution. The esteemed individual could purchase a large block of subscriptions to town topics at a wildly inflated price, often thousands of dollars. The purchase would, of course, ensure the item's immediate removal from the printing plates. It was a naked shakedown, but man's genius was in his framing. The transaction was never called blackmail. It was a loan to the publication or an investment in a lucrative advertising contract. He kept meticulous ledgers of these payments, treating them as legitimate business income, which gave him a veneer of legal protection. He was not selling silence, he argued. He was selling overpriced paper. The reach of this scheme was staggering. It is rumored that the subscription list for town topics read like a who's who of American aristocracy. Names like Astor, Vanderbilt, Whitney, and Morgan were all said to be on his books. Their regular payments a necessary cost of doing business in high society. The irony was profound. The very people who set the social rules, who demanded absolute propriety from everyone else, were the ones funding the institution that threatened to expose them. They were trapped. Paying man made them complicit in his scheme and ensured his continued power over them. Refusing to pay meant social annihilation. He even had the audacity to approach the formidable Carolina Store, the queen bee herself, who was rumored to have paid him off to keep her son's messy divorce out of his pages. If Mrs. Astor was vulnerable, then no one was safe. Man's network of informants was vast and insidious. He cultivated sources everywhere, disgruntled servants, jealous rivals, and most effectively, the elite themselves. At the endless rounds of parties and dinners, guests would often share gossip with his reporters, unaware they were providing the very ammunition that would later be used against them or their friends. The system fed on the community's own vanity and spite. Town topics became a toxic mirror held up to high society, reflecting its deepest insecurities and most vicious instincts back at it, all while its editor, Colonel Mann, grew wealthier and more powerful than many of his victims. He didn't just report on the gilded class. He mastered them, exposing the brutal truth that in a world built on appearances, the greatest power often belongs not to those who shine in the spotlight, but to those who control the shadows just offstage. This entire elaborate system of extortion thrived in a legal and social vacuum, a perfect storm of vulnerability that the blackmailers exploited with cold precision. On the surface, it seems illogical. These were the most powerful people in America, with fortunes that could hire armies of lawyers and private detectives. Why didn't they simply go to the police? The answer lies in a brutal calculation where involving the law was never a solution. It was the catastrophic final act of the scandal they were desperately trying to avoid. For a victim, walking into a police precinct was the equivalent of taking out a full-page advertisement in every newspaper announcing that they had a terrible secret worth paying to hide. The justice system of the Gilded Age was not the impartial institution we might imagine today. In many cities, particularly New York, it was famously corrupt, tangled in the web of political machines like Tammany Hall. A police officer or a judge was as likely to be on the payroll of a powerful interest as they were to uphold the law. For a wealthy individual, the risk was twofold. First, they could never be certain that the officer they confided in wasn't himself connected to the blackmail ring or willing to sell the information to the highest bidder. Trusting a corrupt system with your most damaging secret was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Second, even an honest officer would have to open an investigation, creating a paper trail and involving multiple people. A secret known by a police captain, a beat cop, and a court clerk was a secret no longer. The very mechanism designed to provide justice would become the vehicle for the scandal's dissemination. But the greatest deterrent was the court of public opinion, which was far more ruthless and unforgiving than any court of law. A trial, even if it resulted in the blackmailer's conviction, would be a public spectacle. Every salacious detail of the accusation, the secret family, the forged love letters, the financial impropriety, would be read aloud in a crowded courtroom and then splashed across the front pages of William Randolph Hearst's and Joseph Pulitzer's sensationalist newspapers. These yellow journalism rags feasted on the misfortune of the elite, and a high society blackmail trial would be the story of the decade. The victim would achieve a legal victory at the cost of their social annihilation. They would win the case but lose everything that mattered: their standing, their family's honor, and their carefully constructed place in the world. This placed the victim in an impossible double bind. Paying the blackmailer meant a lifetime of financial servitude to a phantom, but it promised the continuance of their public life. It was a private hell, but a hidden one. Going to the police meant a chance, however slim, of stopping the blackmailer, but it guaranteed a very public execution of their reputation. For a society that valued appearance above all else, the choice was clear. It was better to live with a hidden monster than to be publicly devoured. This collective silence created a code of omerta among the elite, an unspoken agreement to handle these matters in-house, with private detectives and discreet settlements, because the official channels of justice offered not protection, but exposure. The blackmailers didn't just operate in a legal gray area. They had cleverly built their entire enterprise in the one place the law could not reach: the space between a public truth and a private fear. This transatlantic marriage market, where American dollars revitalized fading European titles, created an entirely new frontier for the professional blackmailer. The dynamic was uniquely perilous. An American heiress arriving in England or France wasn't just marrying a man. She was marrying into an institution centuries old, with traditions, prejudices, and a deep, ingrained suspicion of outsiders. Her greatest asset, her vast fortune, was also her greatest vulnerability in the eyes of her new family, who often viewed new money as inherently tainted. A blackmailer could exploit this cultural chasm with surgical precision, threatening to expose the very qualities that made the heiress an attractive bride in the first place. The threats took two primary forms, each designed to terrify both the bride and her ambitious family back in New York. The first targeted the perception of New World vulgarity. European aristocracy prided itself on a quiet, understated elegance that came from generations of assured status. American manners, by comparison, could seem loud, overly familiar, and obsessively focused on the display of wealth. A blackmailer might claim to possess letters or witness accounts suggesting the heiress's mother had been involved in trade, a social death sentence, or that the family's fortune originated in something considered crass, like pork packing or retail. Even the heiress's own behavior could be weaponized. A moment of unchecked laughter at a dinner, a too frank opinion offered in mixed company, or a gown deemed excessively opulent could be twisted into a narrative of coarse American behavior that would horrify her staid-in-laws. The second and far more dangerous form of threat concerned the financial arrangements themselves. These unions were essentially business contracts. Elaborate marriage settlements were drawn up, specifying exactly how much of the American fortune would be used to restore the noble family's estates, pay off its debts, and provide an allowance. These details were meant to be intensely private. For an aristocratic family, admitting the precise sum paid for a bride was a profound humiliation, a public confirmation that their ancient name had a price tag. A blackmailer who obtained the details of such a settlement held a weapon of mass destruction. Leaking, it would not only expose the family to ridicule, but could also trigger a cascade of financial demands from other creditors who now knew exactly how much money had entered the household. Consider the plight of a fictionalized heiress, Beatrice Winthrop, sailing to England to become the Duchess of Ashworth. Her family had negotiated a superb settlement, providing a colossal dowry to rescue the Duke's dilapidated estate, while carefully structuring the payments to ensure Beatrice's future financial security and influence. Weeks before the wedding, her father in New York receives an anonymous letter. It doesn't ask for money from him. Instead, it coolly informs him that a copy of the full, unredacted marriage settlement will be sent to every major newspaper in London and every member of the House of Lords unless a separate, direct payment is made to the blackmailer. The threat is brilliantly cynical. Paying off the blackmailer is an act of betrayal against the Duke's family, as it uses funds meant for the estate. But not paying guarantees a scandal so immense it would call off the wedding instantly. The Winthrops are forced to choose between sabotaging their daughter's future marriage from within or destroying it from afar. The logistics of these transatlantic schemes were complex, giving the blackmailers an added layer of protection. Demands might be sent from a post office in Paris to an address in Newport, while the proof was held by an accomplice in London. This made tracing the culprit nearly impossible for a single family operating across jurisdictions and legal systems. Furthermore, the very act of investigating the threat increased the risk of exposure. Sending a private detective across the ocean to make inquiries would inevitably draw attention, potentially alerting the noble family to the problem and creating the exact scandal everyone wanted to avoid. The geographical distance turned the Atlantic Ocean into a moat that protected the blackmailer, leaving the victim's family isolated, helpless, and ultimately more willing to pay simply to make the problem disappear. In the high-stakes game of transatlantic alliance, a blackmailer held the best cards, knowing that for an American family that had invested so much in securing a title, silence was a price they would pay almost anything to keep. Faced with this impossible choice between paying a phantom or inviting public ruin, wealthy families desperately sought a third option, a way to fight back against their tormentors from the shadows. Their solution was to hire the era's other burgeoning shadow industry, the private detective agency. Firms like the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, already famous for pursuing train robbers and busting unions, now found a lucrative new clientele in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. For a staggering fee, they offered a promise of discretion and resolution, positioning themselves as the only force capable of protecting the elite from themselves. Yet in this murky world of secrets, the line between protector and predator became dangerously blurred, turning the private eye into a double-edged sword. A family patriarch, receiving a blackmail note, could not go to the public police, but he could summon a Pinkerton agent to his private study. The meeting itself was a testament to the agency's reputation for absolute confidentiality. The agent, often a stern, serious man who had seen the gritty underbelly of American life, would listen to the painful confession without judgment. His mandate was clear: identify the blackmailer, recover any incriminating evidence, and neutralize the threat, all without a single word of the affair ever leaving the room. This work required a different skill set than chasing outlaws across the plains. It demanded a deep understanding of high society's intricate codes, an ability to blend in at a Newport lawn party or a gentleman's club, and a network of informants that could rival Colonel Mann's. The methods they employed were as varied as the threats they faced. An agent might be planted in the household as a new footman, watching for any servant who seemed unusually curious or who was living beyond their means. They would conduct discreet surveillance on dead drop locations, hoping to identify the individual who collected the extortion money. In cases involving forged letters, they might hire handwriting experts to disprove the authenticity, giving the family the confidence to call the blackmailer's bluff. Their greatest power was their brand name. The mere hint that the Pinkertons were now involved was often enough to scare off a low-level opportunist, as it signaled the target was willing to fight back with immense resources. However, this very intimacy with corruption created a profound and toxic conflict of interest. The same detective hired to investigate a blackmail threat would, in the course of his duties, inevitably learn the client's deepest, most damaging secret. He now held the very information that had fueled the extortion plot in the first place. For an agent of absolute integrity, this was a professional burden. But for one with flexible morals, it was an irresistible opportunity. The Pinkerton agency itself was famously rigorous, but the field was crowded with smaller, less scrupulous operations and individual freelance operatives. The temptation to become the blackmailer oneself was overwhelming. Why spend weeks on a dangerous investigation for a single fee from the client, when you could simply secure the evidence and then demand a perpetual income stream from them instead? The protector could, in an instant, become the predator. This created a nightmare scenario for the wealthy family. In hiring a detective, they were essentially inviting a fox into the henhouse and hoping it would only eat the other foxes. They had to trust that the man they were paying to protect their secret was not, in fact, meticulously documenting it for his own future use. There are whispered accounts of investigations that mysteriously stalled, of evidence that was never quite recovered, of blackmail demands that continued long after a detective was hired, almost as if the perpetrator had been forewarned of every move. In the most sinister cases, a detective might even have been the blackmailer from the very beginning, using a fake threat to get himself hired, and then leveraging that position to gain even more compromising information. The private detective agency thus became a perfect mirror of the Gilded Age's central paradox. The tools used to maintain a facade of respectability were often mired in the very corruption they were meant to combat. A family seeking to protect its name had to place its trust in a shadowy figure who operated entirely outside the law, armed with the power to either save them or destroy them completely. It was the ultimate gamble, a reflection of the era's grim understanding that in a world built on secrets, no one could ever be entirely trusted, and salvation often came at the risk of a far more damnation. Even the most meticulously constructed schemes, built on a foundation of fear and silence, are vulnerable to a single, unpredictable element: human nature. For years, the blackmail ring operated with impunity because its success was predicated on the predictable behavior of its victims, the desperate, calculated decisions of those with everything to lose. But what happens when a target is pushed so far that they find themselves with nothing left to protect? The first cracks in this gilded fortress did not appear because of a brilliant detective or a change in the law. They appeared because of a quiet, broken man in a mansion on Fifth Avenue who simply decided he could not pay anymore. His name was not Cornelius Holloway, but his story echoes that archetype. Let's call him Arthur Pembroke. Pembroke was a banking magnate, a man whose name was synonymous with fiscal prudence and cold, rational calculation. For over a decade, he had been a reliable source of income for his blackmailer, making regular payments to keep a youthful indiscretion, a failed business venture with borderline fraudulent accounting, from destroying the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. He paid through market crashes and personal tragedies, the annual drain on his finances, a constant, grinding anxiety. But the final demand broke him. It came not with the usual veiled threats, but with a baldly stated ultimatum: double the payment or face exposure. The blackmailer, grown fat and overconfident on a decade of easy victories, had gotten greedy. In that moment, Pembroke didn't feel fear or rage. He felt a strange, hollow calm. The endless payments would bankrupt him eventually anyway. If he was to be ruined, he decided, he would rather be ruined on his own terms. His rebellion was not a loud, public confrontation. It was a silent strike. He simply stopped. He did not respond to the next threatening letter. He did not show up at the designated dead drop in the park. For the first time in over 10 years, the stream of money ceased. This unexpected resistance sent a shockwave through the invisible network. The blackmailer, accustomed to obedience, was baffled and then enraged. In a critical error of judgment, they escalated. The correspondence became more frequent, more desperate, and crucially, less careful. The language shed its faux polite veneer, becoming cruder and more direct. In one furious missive, the blackmailer made a vague but threatening reference to a specific document from the failed venture, a detail only someone with intimate knowledge of the deal would know. This was the mistake Pembroke had been waiting for. That specific detail was the clue that narrowed the field of suspects from a phantom to a handful of living, breathing people from his past. Pembroke was not entirely alone. He finally confided in his eldest son, a sharp-minded lawyer who had been kept in the dark for years. Together, they bypassed the corruptible local police and the risky private detectives. Instead, they used the family's considerable political influence to reach a senior, trusted official at the United States Postal Inspection Service. This was a masterstroke. The USPS was one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies, and it took crimes conducted through the mail with deadly seriousness. They were famously incorruptible and operated with a level of discretion that the city police could not match. The Pembrokes provided the letters, and the postal inspectors began a quiet, methodical investigation, tracing paper stocks, analyzing typewriter fonts, and setting up surveillance on the dead drop locations. While the Pembrokes' quiet war was underway, a parallel front was opening in the press. The dam of silence that had protected the blackmailers for so long began to spring leaks. It started not with a grand exposé, but with a series of thinly veiled satires and fictionalized accounts in publications like Puck and Life magazine. These pieces didn't name names, but they painted a devastatingly accurate portrait of a powerful class held hostage by shadowy figures. The inside jokes were a little too inside, the details a little too specific. Society readers chuckled nervously, recognizing themselves and their friends in the caricatures. The wider public, however, began to get a glimpse into a system of corruption they never knew existed. The real turning point, however, was a feud within the elite itself. When the son of a prominent family was targeted over a gambling debt his powerful father didn't pay. Instead, he used his own newspaper to launch a broadside against his perceived enemies, accusing a rival family of being behind the smear campaign. This very public, messy fight between two titans of industry spilled the entire sordid practice of blackmail out of the shadows and onto the front pages. It provided the opening a crusading journalist needed. In 1905, a reporter named William Inglis, writing for the New York Evening Telegram, managed to get his hands on the infamous ledgers of Colonel Mann's town topics. He published a series of articles that did what no one had dared to do before. He named names. He detailed the vast sums paid by the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Whitneys to keep their secrets out of the magazine. The public revelation was seismic. The carefully maintained facade of unimpeachable aristocracy crumbled overnight. Colonel Mann, once untouchable, was suddenly the subject of public mockery and legal scrutiny. He was hauled before a grand jury, and though he ultimately escaped conviction on technicalities, his power was broken. The spectacle of society's queen bees being revealed as paying customers of a gossip monger was a humiliation from which the old system never truly recovered. The era of the omnipotent blackmailer was ending, not with a single arrest, but with a collective loss of nerve. The victims saw that silence was no longer a guarantee of safety, and the blackmailers discovered that the fear they had traded on for so long could, when finally exhausted, turn into a weapon pointed directly back at them. The whispers, the paid subscriptions, the discreetly handled envelopes of cash. For decades, the machinery of high society blackmail had operated in the shadows, its power reliant on a shared, terrified silence. But in the spring of 1906, that silence was shattered by the gavel of a judge in a New York City courtroom. The catalyst was not a titan of industry fighting back, but a feud between two members of the elite that spiraled so wildly out of control it forced the entire sordid system into the blinding light of public justice. The case was the People of the State of New York v. Edwin Main Post, and it would become the most sensational society trial of the Gilded Age. Edwin Post was no Colonel Mann, but he moved in the same murky waters. A well-born architect and society figure, he had taken a financial interest in and written for a gossip sheet called the Newport Observer, a publication that followed the town topics model of veiled insinuation and whispered threat. His target was a prominent socialite and architect named Stanford White, a man whose own flamboyant life made him a perfect subject for scandal. The feud between Post and White was deeply personal, rooted in professional rivalry and social slights. Post's paper began publishing a series of increasingly bold items, accusing White of various moral and financial transgressions. The accusations were just vague enough to be legally perilous, yet pointed enough to cause White significant damage. Stanford White was a man of immense talent and equally immense appetite, a celebrated architect who designed some of New York's most famous buildings, but lived a life of notorious excess. He was a figure both admired and whispered about, making him vulnerable. Yet, unlike so many of his peers who chose to pay for silence, White chose to fight. He made a decision that sent a shockwave through the 400. He sued Edwin Post for criminal libel. This was a breathtaking gamble. By taking the matter to court, White was inviting the very publicity everyone else paid a fortune to avoid. He was betting his own reputation that a public airing of the facts would destroy his accuser instead of himself. The trial that followed was a media circus, a spectacle that laid bare the inner workings of the gossip economy for all of America to see. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, curiosity seekers, and society figures who attended with a mixture of horror and fascination, terrified their own names might be dragged into the proceedings. For the first time, the methods of the blackmailing press were described under oath. Reporters from The Observer testified about being instructed to gather salacious information not for publication, but for leverage. They described the process of approaching the subjects of stories with offers to suppress the material in exchange for cash or advertising revenue. The genteel euphemisms were stripped away, revealing the crude extortion at its core. The most damning evidence, however, came from the elite themselves. Subpoenaed to testify, several of New York's most powerful men were forced to take the stand and admit, under oath, that they had indeed paid money to Post in his publication. Each admission was a humiliation, a public confession that they had participated in the very system that held them hostage. Their testimony revealed the paralyzing fear that governed their lives, the fear of scandal so profound that they would willingly fund their own tormentors rather than risk a whisper of impropriety. The court record became a stark ledger of their weakness. The jury found Edwin Post guilty, and the verdict was celebrated as a victory for decency. But the true victory was far more significant than the conviction of one man. The trial had performed a brutal public autopsy on the entire culture of blackmail. It demonstrated, for any wealthy individual who still harbored doubts, that the fear of exposure was the blackmailer's only real weapon. Once that fear was overcome, once someone was willing to stand up and say, "Publish it," then the entire house of cards could collapse. Stanford White, for all his flaws, had shown it was possible to fight back and win. Tragically, he would not live to see the full impact of his victory. He was murdered just weeks after the trial's conclusion in a famously sensational crime unrelated to the case. But the precedent was set. The invisible wall of silence that had protected the blackmailers for a generation now had a crack running right through its center, a crack made by the sound of a courtroom gavel and the rustle of 100 newspaper reporters taking notes. The stunning public airing of the blackmail economy in the courtroom, and the press didn't just punish a few individuals. It fundamentally altered the social landscape for the American elite. The immediate fallout was a cascade of ruined reputations, but the victims were not only the blackmailers. For the first time, the paying clients of this shadow industry, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, found their own judgment and standing called into question. The public revelation that they had been funding the very system that tormented them did not garner sympathy. It inspired ridicule and a profound loss of respect. They were exposed not as powerful titans, but as fearful, compromised figures who had chosen complicity over courage. Their carefully curated images of unassailable authority were permanently tarnished, making them look like fools who had purchased their own gilded cages. This collective humiliation triggered a newfound and deeply ingrained wariness that reshaped social interactions at the highest levels. The old, open trust that had characterized the Gilded Age's glittering social season evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of suspicion. The elite began to retreat behind even higher walls, both literal and metaphorical. Extravagant, multi-course dinners where secrets were once freely exchanged over brandy and cigars were replaced with smaller, more intimate gatherings of only the most trusted friends. The practice of keeping a diary, once a fashionable pastime, fell sharply out of favor for fear its pages could be stolen and used against the author. A casual compliment or a seemingly benign question from an acquaintance was now scrutinized for hidden meaning or a potential trap. The very air in the ballrooms grew heavier, charged with the unspoken anxiety that anyone, from a new debutante to a trusted family friend, could be an informant. This cultural shift directly accelerated the decline of the absolute power once wielded by the old guard, epitomized by queens like Caroline Astor. Her reign, and that of her fellow matrons, had been built on their role as the ultimate arbiters of reputation. They decided who was in and who was out based on a rigid, unwritten code. But the Blackmail scandal revealed a terrifying truth: that there was a parallel, shadow economy of reputation operating entirely outside their control. If a Vanderbilt could be brought low not by a social snub from Mrs. Astor, but by a typed letter from an anonymous criminal, then what real power did the old social structures still hold? The authority of the matrons was exposed as theatrical, a performance of control in a world where real power had been seized by those willing to traffic in pure, ruthless information. A broader cultural change was also underway, one that the Blackmail scandal perfectly catalyzed. The public's appetite for the inner workings of the elite, once fed by fawning society columns, was now ravenous for exposés and satirical takedown. The mystique of the 400 was broken. They were no longer seen as distant, god-like figures of perfection, but as deeply flawed, hypocritical, and anxious people, just like everyone else, only with much more to lose. This demystification eroded the very foundation of their social power, which was the public's belief in their inherent superiority. The new century, with its progressive impulses and growing disdain for unearned privilege, was already turning a skeptical eye on the excesses of the Gilded Age. The Blackmail trials provided all the evidence needed to confirm that behind the marble facades and diamond tiaras lay a world of moral compromise and profound insecurity, a revelation from which the old aristocracy could never fully recover. But what drove these individuals to construct such an elaborate and cruel enterprise? While financial gain was the engine of the operation, the fuel powering it was a far more complex mix of human emotions, with motivations ranging from cold greed to burning resentment and a profound, intoxicating hunger for power. Understanding the psychology of the blackmailer is key to understanding how this shadow economy could flourish for so long. For many, the motivation was brutally simple: a calculated pursuit of wealth. These were the opportunists who saw a clear, exploitable flaw in the system of high society. They weren't driven by a personal vendetta against the elite. They viewed them dispassionately as a rich vein of ore to be mined. Their approach was cold, logical, and entirely transactional. They identified a vulnerability, calculated the maximum sum the target could reasonably pay without causing total financial collapse, and executed their plan with the precision of a corporate takeover. The emotional devastation of their victim was irrelevant, a mere side effect of a successful business operation. This pure profit blackmailer was perhaps the most terrifying of all because they were so devoid of malice. They were simply amoral entrepreneurs operating in the most lucrative market they could find. A second and arguably more potent driving force was a deep-seated sense of resentment and a desire for class revenge. This was the motivation for the disgruntled former servant, the failed businessman, or the impoverished aristocrat. These individuals had been on the inside, or at least close enough to feel the sting of exclusion and condescension. They had witnessed the incredible waste, the casual cruelties, and the staggering sense of entitlement that characterized the gilded class. Their blackmail was not just a way to make money. It was a form of retribution, a way to balance the scales. Every payment they extracted was a small victory, a moment where the powerful were forced to acknowledge their authority. It was a way to turn the elite's own greatest weapon, their wealth, against them, forcing them to pay for the privilege of maintaining the very system that created such vast inequality. For this kind of blackmailer, the psychological payoff was as important as the financial one. The money was a measure of their success, but the real satisfaction came from watching a Vanderbilt or an Astor squirm, from knowing that they, a mere servant or a Chinese letter gentleman, held the power to topple a giant. The most complex and intoxicating motivation, however, was the sheer lust for power. Colonel William Dalton Mann is the prime example of this psychology. He was already a wealthy man from his various ventures. The money from his extortion scheme, while substantial, seemed to be as much a scorecard as a necessity. What Mann truly craved was influence and control. His operation granted him a godlike authority over the most powerful people in America. He could summon them to his office, force them to listen to his veiled threats, and watch as they acquiesced to his demands. He didn't just want their money. He wanted their fear, their deference, their acknowledgement that he was the ultimate arbiter of their fate. The ledgers he kept, meticulously recording the payments from the rich and famous, were not just accounting books. They were trophies, a physical manifestation of his dominance. For a man like Mann, who craved social recognition but was forever an outsider, this was the ultimate revenge and the ultimate validation. He couldn't get into Mrs. Astor's ballroom as a guest, but he could make her come to him as a supplicant. This psychological need to invert the social order, to become the puppet master pulling the strings of high society, was a more powerful motivator than any bank balance. The blackmailer, in this sense, was the ultimate symbol of the Gilded Age's hypocrisy, a man who exposed the corruption of the elite by becoming the most corrupt figure of all while reveling in the intoxicating sense of power it afforded him. To understand why these powerful figures chose a lifetime of financial servitude over confrontation, we must step into their world and feel the weight of the two emotions that govern their existence: fear and shame. This was not a simple fear of embarrassment. For the Gilded Age elite, social exile was a form of living death, an erasure of one's identity and legacy that was far more terrifying than any financial loss. Their entire lives were a performance on the most exclusive stage in the world, and the blackmailer held not just a secret, but the power to bring the curtain down forever. Shame was the poison that made the fear so potent. The secrets they guarded were not random. They were precisely the things that violated the core tenets of the society they fought so hard to join. For a man, it was often a failure of character or control, an illicit affair that betrayed his role as a paterfamilias, a hidden gambling debt that revealed financial instability, or a business dealing that crossed the line from shrewdness into fraud. For a woman, the stakes were even higher, centered almost exclusively on her perceived purity and the preservation of her reputation for a successful marriage. A rumored indiscretion, real or invented, could render her unmarriageable. In both cases, the shame came from the hypocrisy, the glaring chasm between their public image of flawless morality and the messy, human failing they hid away. This combination created a psychological prison from which paying the blackmailer seemed like the only escape. The decision to pay was not a sign of weakness, but a cold, calculated business transaction. These were, after all, masters of finance. They conducted a brutal cost-benefit analysis. On one side of the ledger was a known quantity, a painful but manageable annual payout that could be disguised through creative accounting. On the other side was an incalculable risk, the complete and total annihilation of their social standing, the ruin of their children's prospects, and the collapse of business alliances built on a foundation of perceived integrity. The math was terrifyingly simple. It was cheaper to pay the ghost. The constant state of anxiety became a corrosive part of their daily lives. Every new servant's glance felt like a threat. Every unexpected letter on the silver mail tray caused a jolt of panic. They became paranoid, seeing potential conspirators in every new face at the club, in every journalist who asked a probing question. The payment itself was a recurring humiliation, a ritual that reinforced their powerlessness. A titan of industry who commanded thousands of men would find himself alone in a foggy park, stuffing a packet of cash into a hollow tree, taking orders from an unseen tormentor. The money was one thing, but the psychological toll of this perpetual servitude eroded their sense of self, transforming them from captains of their own destiny into prisoners in their own gilded mansions, forever waiting for the next demand to arrive. For women navigating the treacherous social landscape of the Gilded Age, the threat of blackmail carried a uniquely devastating weight. Their legal and financial standing was perilously fragile, making them exceptionally vulnerable targets. Under the laws of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed by her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, sign contracts, or keep her own wages. Her entire existence was legally tethered to her spouse. This meant that if a blackmailer threatened a married woman, she had no independent means to pay them off. She couldn't discreetly access funds or sell assets to silence her tormentor. She faced an impossible choice: confess the threat to her husband, a humiliating and potentially marriage-ending act, or attempt to handle it herself, often by pawning jewelry or running up secret debts with dressmakers, which only created new vulnerabilities. An unmarried heiress, while possessing her fortune and name, was often tightly controlled by a male trustee, a father, brother, or lawyer, who managed her money until marriage. Any attempt to withdraw large sums to pay a blackmailer would immediately raise alarms and invite the exact scrutiny she was trying to avoid. Their wealth was a gilded cage, offering no real power to solve a crisis in secret. The nature of the secrets used against women was also distinctly gendered and brutally effective. For a man, a blackmail secret often revolved around a failure of business ethics or at extramarital affair transactions that, while scandalous, were often tacitly understood in certain circles. For a woman, the accusations targeted her very essence as defined by society: her purity, her chastity, and her reputation as a suitable wife. A rumor of a premarital romance, an alleged indiscretion with a dancing instructor, or even the suggestion of a too bold personality could be enough to derail a promising engagement and exile her from respectable society. The evidence didn't need to be strong. The mere accusation could stain her permanently. This made women perfect targets for fabricated claims. A blackmailer could forge a few love letters, invent a story about a clandestine meeting, and present it to a terrified young woman or her family, knowing the social cost of fighting the allegation would be far greater than the financial cost of paying to make it disappear. Their value was their perceived flawlessness, and that made them a constant target. Yet, in a fascinating twist, women were not merely passive victims in this shadow economy. Their unique position within society also made them exceptionally effective perpetrators and informants. The most common female blackmailer was often a woman who had been cast out of this gilded world herself, a former lady's maid or companion who had been dismissed without a reference. This woman possessed priceless intelligence. She knew the layout of the bedroom where her mistress hid letters, the name of the doctor who made discreet house calls, the source of the mysterious sadness that required a nightly tonic of laudanum. When her loyalty was repaid with dismissal, that intimate knowledge curdled into a weapon. She could extort her former employer with a terrifying precision no outsider could ever match, demanding payments to a post office box to keep the secrets she had once been paid to keep. Other women operated from within the social world itself. A widowed society matron of fading fortune, still invited everywhere but barely able to maintain her own household, found a new revenue stream by becoming a silent partner to figures like Colonel Mann. At every ball and luncheon, she was a ghost at the feast, her sharp eyes and ears tuned not to the gossip itself, but to its potential monetary value. She would note the tension between a certain husband and wife, observe a young heiress sneaking away to the garden with a man who was not her suitor, or catch a fragment of a conversation about a precarious business investment. This intelligence, whispered to a waiting reporter or sold directly to the subject, became a currency that allowed her to maintain her place in the very society she was betraying. She traded on her access and her deep understanding of social nuance to identify the cracks in every polished facade. Perhaps the most complex figure was the woman who used blackmail as a tool of desperate last resort. A woman seduced and abandoned by a powerful man, left with a child and no means of support, might use the threat of exposure not to become rich, but simply to secure a modest annuity for her child's welfare. While still extortion, her motivation was born of absolute powerlessness within a system that offered her no legal recourse for breach of promise or paternity suits. In a world that denied them formal power, some women learned to weaponize the only thing they had: the secrets of the powerful men who sought to use and discard them. They navigated this dark underworld not as queens, but as prisoners turning the locks on their own cages, finding a sliver of agency in the economy of fear that defined the era. This shadow war of extortion required a battlefield, and the blackmailers transformed the very heart of New York City into a stage for their clandestine operations. Their methods were not born of brute force, but of a chilling, meticulous spycraft that would impress a modern intelligence agency. Every transaction was a carefully choreographed ballet of anonymity, designed to ensure the blackmailer never had to risk a face-to-face meeting that could lead to identification or capture. The first step was always communication, and for this, they turned to a seemingly innocuous public forum: the personal advertisement columns of the city's major newspapers. To the average reader, these sections were filled with mundane notices about lost pets and job opportunities. But for the initiated, they were a secret telegraph system. A blackmailer might place a coded message in the New York Herald, instructing their target to look for a message from a concerned friend in the Tuesday edition. The following day, the victim would scour the papers, their heart pounding, until they found another ad, this one containing the specific instructions for the payoff. The language was always veiled in plausible deniability, speaking of business propositions and consultation fees. But the meaning was terrifyingly clear to the intended recipient. Once the terms were set, the actual exchange was an exercise in psychological torment designed to maximize the victim's anxiety. The chosen locations were always public, yet offered a shred of privacy: a specific bench in Madison Square Park at a precise time after dusk, a designated shelf in the reading room of the Astor Library, or a quiet corner of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These dead drops turned the city's landmarks into a nerve-wracking maze. The wealthy elite, accustomed to commanding their surroundings, were reduced to following precise, humiliating orders. A railroad tycoon would be instructed to walk a specific circuit around the reservoir in Central Park, finally depositing a sealed packet of unmarked bills into a hollow at the base of a particular oak tree. A society matron might be told to purchase a first-class ticket on a train to Philadelphia, leave the envelope on her seat, and disembark before the train departed, watching her secret and her money pull away from the station without her. The containers for these payments were chosen for their utter mundanity, making them invisible in plain sight. A specific book, its title and edition carefully specified, would be left on a library shelf with the money tucked between its pages. A folded newspaper, abandoned on a park bench, would contain the ransom inside its sports section. Some blackmailers even used the city's infrastructure, instructing victims to slide the payment through a crack in a specific retaining wall or to leave it under a particular loose cobblestone in a quiet alley. This attention to mundane detail was a final, masterful stroke of psychological manipulation. It meant that every time the victim passed that library, that park bench, or that cobblestone, they were reminded of their powerlessness. Their gilded world, once a symbol of their control and privilege, was now permanently haunted. Every familiar street corner a potential site of their next humiliating transaction with the ghost who held their life in his hands. Moving these colossal sums of money without attracting attention required a level of financial ingenuity that matched the social cunning of the extortion itself. A direct withdrawal of $10,000 from a bank, a sum that could purchase a substantial home, would raise immediate red flags with bank managers and, more dangerously, with family members who monitored the ledgers. The elite, therefore, became masters of a clandestine financial art, creating complex labyrinths of transactions designed to make vast fortunes vanish into thin air, only to reappear in the hands of a ghost. The most straightforward method was also the most perilous: the slow, meticulous siphoning of cash. A businessman like our fictional Cornelius Holloway wouldn't simply write a check to Blackmail services. Instead, he would create a series of false invoices from phantom suppliers to his railroad company. He might approve payments for specialized rail components from a company that existed only on paper, or for consulting services rendered by a non-existent expert. The money would be withdrawn from the business account, and the fake expense would be buried deep within the legitimate costs of running a massive corporation, invisible to auditors and partners alike. For a society matron, the process was more intimate but equally fraught. She might gradually pawn heirloom jewelry over the course of a year, reporting the pieces as lost or stolen to her husband, or she might collude with a compliant dressmaker or jeweler to inflate invoices and receive the difference in untraceable cash. For the truly sophisticated, the next step was to launder this cash through a series of legitimate-seeming channels. This is where the blackmail economy intersected with the upper echelons of finance and law. A trusted, discreet lawyer was an invaluable asset. A victim could deliver a large sum of cash to their attorney under the guise of a private investment or a discretionary fund for a sensitive family matter. The lawyer would then channel these funds through their firm's client trust account. From there, the money could be dispersed in a way that severed any connection to its original source. It might be used to purchase a bearer bond, a financial instrument that belongs to whoever holds it, with no registered owner, which could then be handed over to the blackmailer. Alternatively, the lawyer might loan the money to a dummy corporation, a shell company with no actual business operations, which would then make a payment to another seemingly legitimate entity controlled by the extortionist. Each transaction added a new layer of insulation, making the path of the money so convoluted that even a determined investigator would struggle to follow its trail. Colonel Mann of Town Topics perfected this system of legitimized corruption. He didn't demand cash in a park. He demanded payment for subscriptions to his journal at a price of $5,000 per year. This was a stroke of sinister genius. When a Vanderbilt or a store paid this outrageous sum, they could log it on their books as a business expense for advertising or publicity. It was a transaction that could be explained away, however thinly, to a business partner or a spouse. Man kept meticulous ledgers recording these payments as income, creating a paper trail that painted him not as a criminal, but as a publisher with inexplicably wealthy patrons. He transformed the act of extortion into a formal, almost respectable bill of sale, laundering the payments through the ledgers of both his victims and his own operation. This financial dance in the shadows was the silent engine of the entire enterprise, a testament to the grim reality that in the Gilded Age, even corruption could be polished to a high gloss and made to look like just another business deal. Of course, Colonel Mann was not the only spider in this vast web. While he operated with the brazen authority of a press baron, other figures perfected the art of individual surgical strikes. One of the most notorious was a woman known only in hushed circles as the Countess, though she had no claim to any title. A former lady's maid to one of the grandest families in Newport, she had been dismissed without a reference over a trifling mistake. That dismissal, a mere footnote in the life of her employer, forged her into one of the most effective and ruthless freelance operators in the business. Her weapon was her intimate knowledge of the domestic sphere. She knew which closets held skeletons, literally and figuratively. She could spot the slight tremor in a society matron's hand that betrayed a secret morphine addiction, or identify the origin of a piece of jewelry that contradicted a husband's alibi. Her extortion was personal, precise, and terrifyingly well-informed. She didn't deal in vague rumors. Her letters contained specific, verifiable details. The name of a doctor who made discreet late-night calls, the hidden compartment in a desk where love letters were stashed. Her demands were lower than Mann's, but her success rate was extraordinary because her information was unassailable. On the other end of the spectrum was a figure like James Diamond Jim Brady, though not the famous gourmand. This Brady was a failed Wall Street speculator who used his remaining contacts in the financial world to gather a different kind of intelligence. His specialty was corporate and financial secrets. He might learn of a pending railroad merger before it was public, or uncover a massive hidden debt that threatened to topple a bank. His targets were the titans of industry, and his approach was that of a cold-blooded businessman. He would present his findings not as a threat, but as a business proposition. He was simply offering them the first opportunity to invest in the silence surrounding this sensitive information. For a captain of industry, the choice was stark. Pay Brady a fortune to keep the secret, or risk the leak causing a stock crash that could lose them 10 times that amount. He turned stock market insider trading into a form of blackmail, preying on the financial fears of men who were otherwise fearless. These individual operators often found themselves in a strange, parasitic relationship with Mann's town topics. A freelancer like the Countess might sell a particularly juicy piece of gossip to one of Mann's reporters for a quick payoff, effectively outsourcing the extortion to the larger machinery of the journal. Conversely, an item that was too specific or too dangerous for town topics to print might be handed off to a freelancer to exploit through private, direct correspondence. They were rivals in one sense, competing for the same secrets, but they also functioned as an ecosystem, with information and money flowing between the centralized power of the press and the decentralized cunning of the independents. This network was fluid, constantly shifting, and held together by a single, shared understanding. In the Gilded Age, human weakness was the most valuable commodity on Earth, and they were all in the business of mining it. Yet for all the cautionary tales of those who paid and endured, there were others for whom the blackmailer's scheme did not result in a tense stalemate, but in absolute, total ruin. The story of the Rutherford family stands as one of the most devastating examples of this ultimate social annihilation. They were not Vanderbilts or Astors, but they were wealthy, respected, and had painstakingly built their standing over 2 generations through a successful import business. They were precisely the kind of family that lived in terror of a single misstep, and their nightmare began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the discovery of their eldest son's double life. Harrison Rutherford III was the heir apparent, a young man groomed for leadership and expected to marry well to cement the family's position. Handsome and charming in public, he harbored a secret that was utterly incompatible with his family's rigid social world. He was deeply in love with and secretly supporting a young Italian opera singer named Celia. In the bohemian circles of the arts, such a relationship was unremarkable. In the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue, it was social dynamite. It wasn't just the affair itself. It was the perceived vulgarity of it, the association with the theatrical world that the old guard still considered synonymous with prostitution. A blackmailer, likely a stagehand or a minor performer at the opera house, who had pieced the story together, saw an opportunity. The first letter to Harrison Sr. did not ask for money. It simply contained a lock of Celia's distinctive auburn hair and a single line: "Your son's taste in music is as expensive as it is public." The Rutherfords' response was a catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of confronting their son or attempting a discreet settlement, they panicked and tried to make the problem disappear through sheer force of will. Harrison Sr. immediately cut off his son's allowance, hoping to sever the connection to Celia by bankrupting it. He then accelerated plans for Harrison Jr.'s engagement to the daughter of a banking family, a move designed to publicly cement his respectability, and they hoped, convince the blackmailer that the secret had lost its power. This series of actions backfired spectacularly. The desperate young Harrison, now denied funds and facing a forced marriage, did the unthinkable. He went to his blackmailer. He offered to pay the demands himself if the man would only give him time to access his own money, which was held in a trust until his 30th birthday. In doing so, he transformed the threat from a potential scandal into an immediate, actionable debt. The blackmailer, sensing a golden opportunity, agreed, but with exorbitant interest. What followed was a financial death spiral. To meet the escalating weekly payments, Harrison began borrowing against his future inheritance from notorious loan sharks who catered to the reckless sons of the wealthy. He signed ruinous notes using his family name as collateral. When he couldn't pay, the blackmailer, now in league with the loan sharks, made good on his threat. Copies of Harrison's love letters to Celia, along with the details of his crippling debts, were sent not just to society hostesses, but to his fiancé's father and most damagingly, to the business partners of Rutherford Import Company. The revelation was a triple catastrophe. The engagement was instantly broken, a humiliation splashed across the society pages. The family's reputation for probity was shattered, causing business associates to withdraw their credit and investments for fear the company was fundamentally unsound. And finally, the loan sharks emerged from the shadows, demanding immediate payment on Harrison's notes with the full force of the law, which favored the holder of assigned debt. Within 18 months, the Rutherford dynasty was erased. The import business was declared bankrupt, its assets sold to satisfy creditors. The beautiful brownstone on Fifth Avenue was auctioned off, its furnishings and art scattered to the wind. The family, utterly disgraced, retreated in exile to a small town in Europe, their name never again mentioned in polite New York society. The blackmailer hadn't just exposed a secret. He had expertly manipulated the family's own fear and pride into a series of self-destructive decisions that triggered a complete financial and social collapse. In their desperate attempt to protect a carefully crafted illusion, they had handed their tormentor the tools to dismantle their entire world, proving that sometimes the most successful blackmail is the kind that convinces the victim to unlock the door to their own ruin. This collective silence was more than just a personal choice. It was a rigorously enforced social contract, an unspoken code of omerta as binding as any vow of secrecy. To openly admit you were being blackmailed or worse, to discuss it with another member of the elite, was to commit the ultimate social sin. It meant acknowledging the facade was just that, a performance. It would shatter the shared illusion of inherent, untouchable superiority that was the very bedrock of their world. Imagine the scene at a grand ball. Two men, both paying regular tributes to their respective tormentors, would stand side by side smoking cigars, discussing the stock market and the season's polo matches. They would share a knowing look of shared anxiety, a subtle tension around the eyes, but the subject was strictly, utterly off limits. To speak of it would be to acknowledge their mutual vulnerability, to transform from powerful titans into fellow victims, and that was a demotion none were willing to make. This enforced silence created a bizarre and isolating paradox. Each victim believed they were suffering alone, a singularly unlucky target in a world of spotless peers. They had no way of knowing that the man they envied for his unshakable composure was likely jumping at the same shadows, following similar instructions to leave packets of cash in different hollow trees across the same park. This isolation was the blackmailer's greatest ally. It prevented the elite from realizing their collective power. Had they ever compared notes, they might have realized that standing together and refusing to pay would have collapsed the entire predatory system overnight. But the code of silence kept them in separate, gilded cages, each prisoner believing they were the only one behind bars. The reinforcement of this code fell heavily on the matriarchs of society, women like Caroline Astor. Their primary role was to be the guardians of propriety, the enforcers of the invisible rules. For them, the existence of blackmail was not just a personal threat. It was an existential threat to the entire social order they presided over. A public scandal was a contagion that could spread, tarnishing not just one family, but the entire concept of old money respectability. Therefore, the quiet, discreet payment of a blackmail demand was not seen as a moral failure or an act of cowardice. In the warped logic of this world, it was framed as a noble, albeit painful, duty. It was the responsible thing a gentleman did to protect his women from unpleasantness and shield the broader social circle from a damaging spectacle. Paying was spun as an act of self-sacrifice for the greater good of society's facade, a necessary transaction to maintain the collective peace of mind and the pristine public image all of them depended upon. This twisted logic created a system where the victims became the chief enablers of their own torment. Every payment, every quiet withdrawal of cash, every humiliating trip to a dead drop location wasn't just solving an individual problem. It was a vote of confidence in the blackmail economy. It funded the operation, incentivized the hunters to find new prey, and proved to the blackmailers that their business model was not just viable, but spectacularly profitable. The immense fortunes of the Gilded Age, therefore, didn't just build railroads and art collections. They directly financed the very shadow industry that preyed upon them. The elite, in their desperate bid to protect the appearance of power, were funding the mechanism of their own powerlessness, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and finance that could only end when someone, finally, found the courage to break the code and scream into the silence. The relentless exposure of these blackmail schemes did more than just embarrass a few prominent families. It fundamentally fractured the very foundation of Gilded Age society. The scandalous court cases and newspaper exposés pulled back the curtain on a world whose power was built entirely on perception, revealing the rot and insecurity festering behind the marble columns and silk draperies. This collective humiliation marked the beginning of the end for the rigid Omert, a bound world ruled by Mrs. Astor and her 400. The old guard's authority had been exposed as a theatrical performance, a fragile illusion that could be shattered not by a social snub, but by a typed letter from a nobody. The public, and more importantly, the elite themselves, could no longer maintain the belief in their own inherent, untouchable superiority. The mystique was gone, and with it, the absolute power of the old social arbiters. In the wake of this collapse, a new culture of profound privacy and deep-seated skepticism took root among the wealthy. The gilded drawing rooms, once stages for extravagant displays of confidence, became fortified bunkers guarding against intrusion. The era of the massive, multi-course dinner party where secrets were freely exchanged began to wane, replaced by smaller, more intimate gatherings of only the most trusted confidants. Keeping a personal diary fell sharply out of fashion, for fear its pages could be stolen. A casual question from an acquaintance was now scrutinized for hidden meaning. This wasn't just paranoia, it was a learned survival tactic. They had seen how easily trust could be weaponized and how a single servant's observation could unravel a dynasty. The lesson was clear. True security meant building higher walls and letting very few inside. This retreat from public scrutiny and the demystification of the elite ironically helped pave the way for the more open, though still wildly scandalous, era of the Roaring Twenties. The new generation of wealthy heirs and heiresses, having witnessed the downfall of their parents' secretive world, reacted with a defiant embrace of publicity. If their parents' generation had been ruined by the fear of exposure, the flappers and playboys of the 20s would seek to control the narrative by courting exposure on their own terms. They understood the media landscape in a way their predecessors did not. Instead of paying off a colonel man to stay out of the papers, they forged alliances with sympathetic columnists like Walter Winchell, offering carefully managed glimpses into their lives. The scandals of the 20s were out in the open: speakeasies, petting parties, and romantic escapades. But they were often orchestrated, a performance for the cameras rather than a secret to be horrifyingly uncovered. The legacy of the blackmail rings was a societal shift from a culture of hidden corruption to one of calculated visibility. The Gilded Age elite believed they could hide anything behind their wealth. Their descendants in the Jazz Age knew they could not, and so they learned to perform. The fear and shame that had powered the blackmail economy were replaced by a new, modern currency: celebrity. It was a raw and often reckless bargain, trading absolute privacy for a measure of control. The blackmailers had taught the wealthy a brutal lesson about the price of reputation, and the next generation took that lesson to heart, deciding that if your life was going to be public anyway, you might as well be the one directing the show. So as the glittering ballrooms of the Gilded Age faded into memory, the story of its shadow economy of secrets leaves us with a profound and lasting paradox. We see an era defined by its staggering opulence, by fortunes so vast they seem to bend the very laws of economics, and by a social elite whose power appeared absolute. Yet this entire magnificent edifice, these empires of steel and railroads and old money, were built upon a foundation not of granite, but of sand, the fragile, terrified silence of individuals living in perpetual fear of exposure. The greatest threat to these titans wasn't a rival industrialist or a market crash. It was the truth, a single whispered sentence that could unravel everything they had built. The blackmail ring didn't prey on society's weakness. It preyed on its greatest strength, turning an obsession with reputation into a devastating vulnerability. This history holds up a mirror to our own time, doesn't it? We may not receive threatening letters in our carriages, but we live in an age where information is more potent and perilous than ever. Our secrets are digitized, our reputations are curated online, and the potential for exposure is just a click away. The digital blackmailer has replaced Colonel Man, but the human emotions they exploit, the fear, the shame, the desperate desire to maintain a carefully constructed image are timeless. The gilded cages may look different now, but the fundamental truth remains. When we allow our perceived value to become entirely dependent on a flawless public facade, we hand over immense power to anyone who might glimpse the real, imperfect person hiding behind the curtain. We want to hear from you. Looking back through history, what scandal do you think would have made for the most dramatic blackmail plot? Was it a hidden romance between a president and a socialite? A disastrous financial secret buried by a royal family? A lost heir or a forged will that changed the course of a nation? Share your most intriguing historical what if in the comments below. We read every single one. If you found this journey into the hidden anxieties of the elite fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more tales from inside the Gilded Cage, where we're always pulling back the velvet rope to reveal the startling truths of history.